Great. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Um, we're excited to bring you the second workshop that JTF is putting on how to write a strong EDA grant proposal. This is part of JTF's technical assistance program that we provide in order to help communities navigate and apply for the federal funding that is currently available to communities. Our goal for our time together today, or Rebecca, can you advance to the next slide? Thanks. Our goal for our time together today is to understand what makes a strong EDA proposal and how to write a proposal that reflects your community needs and vision, write something that's strong for your community as you're seeking those EDA funds. So after some brief introductions to our presenters today, we'll be talking through a quick overview of the historic levels of funding that are currently available through the EDA American Rescue Plan funding program, and then really dive into some tips and suggestions as you think about starting to write your proposal. We do have quite a few people who are joining us today, so we're going to keep introductions in the chat box. So I see lots of names jumping in, but if you can introduce yourself, where you're joining us from, and if you have any experience with EDA, that would be great. Just a quick background and housekeeping. Everyone is on mute right now and will be through the duration, just given the large attendance that we do have. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. So you're introducing yourself in the chat, which is great. And if you do have questions, please drop them in the Q&A. We'll have time at the end to answer some of those questions. And myself and one of my colleagues, Antonia, will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the course of the presentation as well. And then finally, as I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded and we'll be sharing out the recording link after so that you can pass it along or reference it. And before I hand it over to Rebecca, I just want to do a quick introduction to the Just Transition Fund. We are an organization that works across the country with communities that are impacted by the energy transition to help advance economic solutions that are equitable, inclusive, and low carbon. And we do this through a number of ways, but two of our main programs act as a hybrid model where we are part grant maker, making direct investments into those places that are hardest hit by the energy transition. And then our technical assistance side, where we work on the ground with partners to facilitate conversations and help advance transition planning as communities think about what comes next after a coal plant or coal mine closes in their community. And so today, again, my name is Emily Rhodes. I'm the Technical Assistance and Planning Manager here at the JTF. I do that work on the ground with communities to work through the transition planning process. And I'm very excited to be joined by my colleague, Rebecca Hunick, who has great experience around supporting communities with their EDA applications. And so I am now going to pass it over to Rebecca.
Great, thank you, Emily. And I'm really excited to see everybody popping in. Saw a lot of familiar faces, or not faces, familiar names introducing in the chat. Keep those introductions coming. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of context for why I'm sitting here today talking to you about EDA. I've been teaching and supporting grant seeking for about 15 years. And the last couple of years, I've really focused in on EDA, specifically with rural communities around the country. So I am really excited about the opportunity that's available, especially for coal communities, and excited to be talking to you about the best ways to approach it. So I wanted to start just by reviewing a little bit of where we find ourselves. I think everybody's probably aware of what's on this slide. That's why you've joined. But just to ground us a little bit, the American Rescue Plan has authorized $3 billion in supplemental funding for EDA, which is huge. We all know that. The goal of that funding is to help with economic recovery from the pandemic, and even more pointedly, to build local economies that are going to be resilient to future economic shocks. So just really keep that in mind as we go through talking about how to write a strong EDA proposal, because the best way to write a strong grant proposal is to give the funder what they need. And so that's what they're looking for here. And as we are probably all aware, 300 million of that 3 billion is specifically committed to coal communities. Now remember, that's a floor, not a ceiling. At least 300 million is going to go to coal communities. So just a quick overview of the rescue plan grant competitions. We went into this a little bit more deeply in our previous webinar. And I believe the Just Transition Fund website has a link to the recording. So if folks want a little bit more context on the different competitions, you can get it there. But what we have is a couple of big national competitions that are for regional projects. Here in the beginning, with the Build Back Better Regional Challenge, deadline for which is coming right up, looking at building regional growth clusters with significant deep coalitions, and a similar program with the deadline in January that's more focused on workforce training systems. Then on the regional front, we have the Economic Adjustment Assistance Program, which, like Build Back Better, has a specific set aside for coal communities. And these set asides, just a little bit of a word about these set asides. The fact that there's a coal community set aside doesn't mean that that's the program that all coal communities should be applying for. Indigenous communities are probably going to want to go to the Indigenous communities, even though there's not a coal set aside there. And you're going to want to talk to your economic development representative about that. And we'll have a little bit more to say about that. But just to say, it's a little bit more complicated than just going for the coal community set aside. So economic adjustment assistance is very flexible. Again, it's run at the regional level. There are a lot of different possibilities for the kinds of projects that can be funded through it. Indigenous communities, the same. Travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation is more targeted to communities that have been hard hit in that sector, and is also very flexible, but there's a little bit more of a focus on infrastructure and workforce there. Statewide planning and research networks is to let EDA really evaluate these programs here and build some communities of practice for grantees. And the last two here also have some additional funding allocated at the state level, which is something to be aware of, because if your state is getting significant money for travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation, and that's something that your community is working on, you want to be in that conversation at the state level. So just be aware of those things. So you noticed that I was differentiating on the previous slide between national and regional competitions. And this is some important context when you are setting out to write an EDA grant. They are run very differently than national and regional competitions. So national competitions are just what they sound like. There's a single pot of money for the whole country, a single deadline. Every applicant is competing with every other applicant there. The format of the grant is based around a narrative project description and attachments. At the regional level, there's funding allocated to the EDA regions, and the applications are accepted on a rolling basis. Usually you work more with EDA to develop your application for those. And the central piece of that application is what's called the EDA 900 form, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. So just to give you some context here for how these applications are built. So what makes a strong EDA proposal? I like to start at the very beginning, and anyone who has been part of a grant training I've given in the last decade or so has likely seen the information on this slide, but I always start with it because we have a funny habit in our language in terms of the way we talk about grants. We use language like won, an award. We make it sound like a prize. And a grant is really a contract, not a prize. So when you're thinking about how to approach a grant, keep in mind that you are bidding on a contract to do work for the funder. The funder has something they're trying to accomplish. And remember, for EDA this time, it's that accelerating recovery and building resilient local economies, right? And so as a grantee, what you're doing is proposing work to advance that mission. So what does that mean in terms of actually getting a grant? You need to find the sweet spot here in this little Venn diagram. It starts with understanding your community's needs. It does not start with the funder. And this is sometimes a little bit hard to get your mind around. You're very concerned about getting money for your community. You're looking at what the funder wants. That's important, but the first thing that's important is what your community needs. Okay, so things like transition plans, CEDS, Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, other kinds of planning documents are good places to go for that. But you need to understand your community's needs first, and then understand the funder's mission, EDA's mission here, and figure out where they overlap. You don't want to get too pulled away from what your community needs to what you think the funder wants, and you don't want to force a project that your community needs into the funder's mission if they're not aligned. So that balance there is very, very important. And this is just basic grant seeking. So how does that apply to getting funding? So you need to start with that strong roster of projects that are aligned with community needs. And I'm going to ask Emily to pipe in here a little bit and talk about a tool that Just Transition Fund has for developing that roster of projects, which is really important.
Thanks, Rebecca. Right, so as Rebecca talked about, finding that sweet spot, understanding your community's needs so as to identify those areas of overlap for the mission. Finding those right projects in that roster, that takes time and planning. You want to make sure you have a strong understanding and background work to determine what is needed to move different projects forward, whether that's different partnerships that need to be built, understanding the different funding levels or what goes into that. And that these roster of projects are being developed by those who are most impacted by the economic transition, by the challenge that you're seeking to address through your proposal. So having a robust and inclusive community conversation around that is a key component. And so if you're not really sure where to start, the JTF does have transition planning support. We provide transition planning support. So that can be through the technical assistance program that I mentioned early on in our introduction, but we also have on our website our blueprint for a just transition. So this is a series of resources. There's information around leveraging policies. There's some case studies there, but one of the first resources on the site that I want to highlight is a document called Build Your Plan. So if you go to our website, look for the blueprint, you can download that document, and it really discusses steps that your community can take, building your leadership team, engaging your community, thinking about the different needs and creating a vision for your transition. And then thinking about planning for the long term and what are those different projects and programs that leverage the assets in your community and what you have on the ground in order to help advance transition planning. So please go and check that out, and then feel free, you can reach out to myself and to our team to talk through your transition planning efforts. But it's a really great resource as a place to start as you're thinking about what are those projects that you want to move forward. So thanks for letting me make that plug, Rebecca.
No, it's really important. That preparation is really, really important when you are getting into grant seeking. It's really important to have your strong projects designed already. And this workshop that we're doing here is assuming that you already have your project design done. But that planning and really understanding needs is the foundation for strong grant seeking. So when you're identifying that sweet spot, you go to the funder, right? So we've got some links here to the funding opportunities, EDA's investment priorities, and the EDA stake contacts, because you also need to talk to the funder, not just read the materials. And for more information about that, you can review the previous webinar that we did in this series. So really what you need to do is propose to do the work that the funder wants to see happen in a way that makes them confident you'll achieve their mission. So how do you do that? What is going to make them confident in your grant proposal? Just a few things here. A clear opportunity for impact, a strong case backed up by data, well-defined project that meets the moment, well-justified project activities and budget, and really strong fulfillment of those review criteria. And we're going to go over each of these. It sounds easy, right? Let's talk about them. So, clear opportunity for impact. This is really important. And I feel like if you take away one thing from this workshop, it should be what's in bold on this slide. Okay. If you have experience writing for other funders, you might be tempted when you're writing an EDA grant to really focus on the need, right? For a lot of funders, it's really important to have a strong sob story, right? You're just how bad things are and how much you need the money. And that's important. You know, EDA wants to fund places that need the money, but EDA needs to put its money in places where it's going to have the most impact. So EDA is looking for opportunities when they're funding projects. EDA is looking for projects that are ready to go and ready to have an impact. So need alone is not going to do it in terms of showing that you're a good place for EDA to invest. Need is important, but it has to be balanced by really showing that opportunity, timeliness, ready for impact. EDA reviewers are going to say, is this going to be transformational in this community? They have a long list of projects that need funding, and they need to put their money in the places where it's really going to have that transformational impact. So that's what you're selling them. You're selling them that opportunity. So you have to really balance the need with the opportunity and potential. You need both of them. Data is very important. So claiming that there's an opportunity is not enough. You need to show it. You need to show why you think this is an opportunity and why you think it can have an incredible impact, right? So clear evidence, using that data to tell a story about that impact. Jobs and private investment really are the most important impact metrics to EDA, but there are a lot of others. And look at your NOFO, look at what they're looking for, and think also about what your community needs in order to get to the jobs and private investment, and show where you are right now with the metrics and show where you think you can go with the project and really back that up. A well-defined project that meets the moment. What do I mean by this? Really good design. The way I suggest you do that is to start with that impact that you want to have and say, okay, what do we need to produce to get to that impact? And in order to produce that, what do we need to do? And in order to do that, what resources do we need? Really work backwards on your basically a logic model that way. So really clear products and deliverables that lead to that impact. The EDA needs to see clearly how it will work and that it's the right project right now for this community. Just like I said, they have a lot of projects that need funding. Well-justified project activities and budget. Clearly, they can only invest in projects that are going to be good stewards of federal funding, right? So it has to be carefully crafted. The budget, it has to make sense. I think that sometimes when folks are approaching grants, they are really careful to try and keep their budget low, right? To show that they're being a good steward of federal funds. But if it's too low, if it's so low that the funder is going to look at it and say, you know, there's no way you can get this done with this money, then you're not going to get funded. It needs to be a reasonable and well-justified budget. And the activities need to be the right ones. The tasks need to be the right ones to get this work done. And we'll talk about how to do this in the next section here. Fulfillment of review criteria. Every grant is reviewed according to specific criteria, and those criteria are detailed in the NOFO. You can find them under the review and selection process section. And that review process has multiple layers depending on the competition. Some, like economic adjustment assistance, have an initial competitiveness review, which is basically triage, right? Where they look at it and say, okay, is this really worth diving into with a full review? Is it likely to be competitive for funding? And we'll look at what that looks like in just a second. Then there's a technical review. Is the proposal technically complete? And anyone who's done an EDA proposal knows they're pretty complex, right? There are a lot of different kinds of attachments, different forms, things that need to be there. So the technical review makes sure everything is there, and they will not move something on to the next stage of merit review if the proposal isn't technically complete. So that's where you can get knocked out for technical incompleteness. And then there's merit review, right? Is this a really strong project? Is it providing what we're looking for here? So let's just look at an example. I'm going to use economic adjustment assistance because I think that's probably the competition that most coal communities are going to be going for, just in terms of the set-asides, how that money is allocated, and the fact that it is going to be able to fund more sort of local and regional projects. So the initial competitiveness review, the triage, is, first of all, is it responsive to the NOFO, right? Is it consistent with the funding guidelines? Is it something that EDA can actually fund? First one. And then, is it aligned with the investment priorities, right? Is this something that is something that's important for EDA to fund? Does it have matching funds? Are they committed? Are they available? What's happening with the matching funds? And this is a place where having matching funds can make you more competitive, even if they aren't required, right? One of the interesting things about the rescue plan funding is that they can fund projects at 100%. And some of the competitions are not requiring matching funds at all, which is great. But just something to keep in mind is that having matching funds might make you a little bit more attractive to EDA because the community has some skin in the game, and because they can feel like they're leveraging more funding. So that's something to sort of carefully think about. Matching funds can also be in kind, but you do have to track them just as if it were federal money. So that's a lot of paperwork. There are a lot of things to consider to do with matching funds. And I advise folks to really think about that. The next competitiveness review criterion is alignment with the CEDS, the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, or if your region doesn't have a CEDS, an equivalent development strategy, and you can talk to your economic development representative about that, what that would be if you don't have a CEDS, but it does need to be aligned there. And the likelihood that it's capable of starting quickly and having an immediate impact. This rescue plan funding is just what it sounds like. It's rescue plan funding. So they're looking for projects that can really get going and have an impact, that can be rescues. So thinking about that when you're designing your projects, and the likelihood that it will be completed. And when they're thinking about this, they can look at the capacity of your organization, right? Can this organization really do this? So, like I said before, competitiveness review passes that. They see if it checks all the boxes technically, and then it can go to merit review. And these are the economic adjustment assistance merit review criteria. So is it responding to community needs? Is it really going to lead to that recovery and diversification, right? This is the first thing. This is what EDA is trying to do with the rescue plan funding. Is it going to be resilient to future economic shocks? Is it feasible? Can it actually be done? And these are all equally weighted. So that's an interesting thing to think about. None of these is supposed to be more important than the others, but it needs to fulfill all of them. Has to be feasible, has to be doable. EDA doesn't want to fund things that are not feasible. Needs to be sustainable, lasting impact, durability. They're talking here about regional stakeholders are bought in. It's integrated with other projects that are happening in the region. It's part of what's happening. It's not pulling in a different direction. Then here we go here with the need, the degree of economic distress, right? So including this is pandemic impact. If your area has had a lot of pandemic impact, that is a criterion that they will take into account. Everywhere has had impact from the pandemic, and you just need to make sure that your grant makes it clear what that has looked like in your community. Is it going to foster job creation and retention? This is really important and basic for EDA, and the quality of those jobs. Are they good jobs? If it's going to promote private investment. If there are strong labor protections, this is especially important for construction and projects like that. And then benefits being shared across all affected communities. Equity is a really important EDA investment priority. So I encourage folks to go and read those investment priorities. They're available. I think I had a link a few slides ago. They're available on EDA's website. Go ahead and read them, check them out, and really read the equity investment priority, because that's what they're talking about here. Really making sure that areas, place equity, areas that haven't been served in the past. This is often rural areas. Other areas can be historically underserved. And then underserved populations as well, making sure that it's really, really clear how that's happening in the project. So given all that, writing, you're sitting down to write this grant, what do you do? This is the process, just to review the whole process before you get to the writing. Contextualize a little bit here. You need to first align your idea with one of those grant programs, make sure it's the right one. Do a really short summary of your idea, connect with EDA and share it with them, and then you write your grant. And that connecting with EDA step is really important. I just want to give a massive shout out to the economic development representatives who are working so hard right now to do this. I really have no idea how they're doing it. They're putting in a heroic effort to really connect with all of the communities and help figure out the best projects to be submitted. So be patient with your EDRs. Make the best possible use of their time, make anything you send to them really short, concise, clear. Make things easy for the EDRs because they have a really big job right now and they're working really hard. So like I said, we did talk about some of this process in the previous webinar. Today we're talking about really submitting that grant. So how do we do that? First, you need a plan. And this is important because things can get lost. These grants are complicated and pieces can get lost in the shuffle. So first you need your team. I do not recommend that one person take this on, right? Sometimes people say, oh, I can do this. You really need a team. This is a big project. You need somebody to manage the process, to make sure that everything's happening. All of the pieces are moving as they should. You need one or more people to write, actually do the writing. You need people to edit, proofread, things like that. You need people to sort of research, find data, things like that. So make sure you know who all of those folks are. And you've divided responsibilities. Make yourself a timeline. And I've got the first bullet here, really make sure that all of your grants.gov registrations are taken care of because that stuff can take time. So do that first, and then make yourself a timeline, a plan for drafts, reviewing, revising, getting all the attachments together, everything like that. So once you've done that, then you need to really understand all of the grant elements and how you're going to develop them. So that could be like the centerpiece, like I said, either a narrative or the ED 900 form, your grants.gov forms, and all of the attachments. And there are usually quite a few attachments involved in EDA grants. So diving into that difference in the centerpiece of the grant, the project narrative for the national competitions or the ED 900 form for the regional competitions. I've got some examples here of the different, just to remind us of which competitions are which. And let's talk a little bit about what this looks like. Here's an example of a project narrative. It's a separate document, Build Back Better, the concept proposal. So Build Back Better is a two-stage process. And the concept proposal that's due next month, these are the elements that it requires in the narrative. And this is just a 5-page narrative, so it's a little bit challenging, right? You got to fit all of this into 5 pages. That vision, what that opportunity is, and you notice that's front and center, just like I was talking about. They really want to know what the opportunity is that they're investing in here. EDA is an investor. Think about it that way. So your vision for the cluster, the opportunity, the members of the coalition, what the potential projects are for that second phase, what metrics you're going to use to look at success, matching fund accessibility for the second phase, barriers and mitigation strategies. This is often important in EDA grants, like what could get in your way and what have you thought of in terms of your project design and your approach that's going to allow you to surmount those barriers. And then the timeline for implementing. When you're writing a project narrative, just some basic things to think about in terms of creating that document. The list that I just showed of the elements that they want in that narrative, which came directly from the NOFO, you need to make that list of what they need in the narrative into headers that you can use in your narrative, and just really make sure they're clear. You don't need to use the whole, you notice that, I'll just go back to this list. If you're looking at the NOFO, these bullets are condensed from the information that they're requesting. So you can condense into a header, a title that works, but make sure you're using the same ones in the order that's requested. Sometimes people try to get a little bit creative and give things in a different order. I don't recommend doing that because then reviewers have to sort of look and flip back and forth and make sure things that are there and that they can miss things. It's a little bit disrespectful to reviewers because they're often tired. They're reviewing a lot of proposals, and you just really need to make sure that they have the information in the order that it's requested. Make sure that the format of the text is really easy to read, and everything that they need is really easy to locate. Follow all those formatting and page limit instructions. And when you upload to grants.gov, make sure it's a PDF. Sometimes grants.gov will allow Word documents and things like that. I don't recommend that because you can't control the formatting in the same way. So always PDF it before you upload. ED 900 form, different story, a very different process. It's a fillable form in grants.gov. It has text fields that you put your narrative into. The text field will be a question, and you put the answer to the question in the text box. And the form fields do have character limits. They're fairly generous character limits. They range, from 4,000 to 10,000 characters, but you do need to be aware of them. Sometimes folks will wax rhapsodic in a 4,000 character box and find that it's too much. So you just need to pay attention to that. And it is only plain text, of course, because you're pasting it into the box in the form. So no formatting. Can't make it pretty. So this is some of the questions on the ED 900 form, just to give you sort of a flavor of it, of the kinds of things that you need to answer. So geographical definition. So where is this? That is this project is happening. Scope of work, what's gonna happen. And then you get into the economic conditions of the region, and how the proposed investment is going to address the need. So it's in a really different order from usual project narratives. But just always focus on the question at hand in your answer in the ED 900 boxes. Your capability. What makes you think you can do this? Partners, how it fits with funding priorities, timeline, and economic impact. So tips for doing, now we have a question about the ED 900. How is there indication in the ED 900 how big of the character fields are? No, you just have to test it. So this is something I advise you to do here. First of all, don't draft in the grants.gov form, draft in a separate word processing document so you can edit and you don't lose things. And as you draft, take those answers and test them against the character limits. Make sure that don't rely on, this is a weird thing that can happen. Don't rely on, say in Word, you can say, how many characters is this? And then you go over, sometimes Word counts characters, as weird as this may sound, sometimes Word counts characters, or Google, whatever you're working in, counts characters slightly differently from how the EDA form will count characters. So the form has the last word, just test it by pasting it in. One thing to know about that space, you don't have to take up all the space. If you really are thoroughly answering the question, don't worry if it's less than the maximum number of characters. The thing to worry about is whether you have thoroughly answered the question. And always refer to those instructions. So in the ED 900 form, toward the end, there's a set of instructions for each question. Always read those, because sometimes the questions themselves can feel a little bit confusing, but the instructions provide really good clarification on what they're wanting to see there. There are a lot of attachments, like I said, to EDA grants. We're not going to go into all of them because they're really different for each project or proposal. But I really, wanted to put in a plug for the budget narrative. Budget narrative, in my opinion, is the most important attachment there is. It's really on a par with the project narrative or the ED 900 form, really important part of the grant. Sometimes people will do the budget narrative last. You go through the grant, put a lot of focus in the project narrative, and kind of do the budget narrative quickly at the end. I really recommend against that. I think the budget narrative is one of the most important parts of the grant, because it shows how you're going to use money to get the work done. And that's the most important thing. So you have to connect each element of the budget back to the grant itself, the project. How is this element of the budget advancing the project? Show exactly how you calculated every cost and make sure that it's really fully justified. And it really should be a compelling document on its own. Somebody should be able to read the budget narrative and say, yes, this is great. A little funny secret of grant reviewing. Every grant reviewer has their own style, but a number of grant reviewers start with the budget narrative, actually, before they read the project narrative. So you need to keep that in mind. They might be doing that. Writing tips, writing style. So there's a habit sometimes with grants, I think, of overcomplicated language. And what I say to that is, remember that your reviewers are tired. They're just trying to get the information out of this. And if you make them slog through complicated sentences, they'll tune out. They won't get it. And that's not what you want. So really keep the language simple, really concise, really readable. This third bullet here, in quotes, let no question fester. A National Science Foundation program officer gave this advice presentation I saw years and years ago. And since then, I've always tried to give as much attention to it as possible. It means that if, as a reviewer is reading along, something they're reading brings up a question in their mind, make sure you either answer that question right there or give an internal reference to where it's answered. Because if they have that question, they're going to be distracted by that question as they continue reading, and they're going to miss what you're trying to tell them. And you don't want that. You need their attention. So let no question fester. Always have somebody read and really make sure that questions are being answered as you go. Show, don't tell. It could also be, you could also say show, don't sell. It's okay to be enthusiastic. You know, they want to fund projects that people are really behind. But if it feels like it's an advertisement for your project, that doesn't work. They'll be turned off by that. They want to see real substance. They want the project to really speak for itself. So be careful with that balance in terms of your enthusiasm in your writing. So, oh, excuse me. I was trying to go back to where I was. Trying to look at the questions. I'm going to wait to look at the questions now so I don't accidentally advance. Balancing data and anecdote. This is another area. So you need that data, you need that evidence. You can't just straight tell a story about why your community needs this investment. But the data itself needs to tell a story. So balancing the story and anecdote with the data, sort of weaving them together to paint that picture of the potential impact. This is sort of the art of grant writing. And like I said, doing that in a way that comes off as letting the project speak for itself and not being overly promotional. So reviewing and revising. Sometimes people write grants at the last minute, don't leave themselves enough time to really review and revise and make the proposal the best it can be. Don't do that. You're putting so much energy. Grants take so much work that you need them to be the highest quality that they can be. So really, like, give yourself the time and space to do this. It's urgent. It's definitely urgent, but also make sure you have time to review and revise. Make sure that the people who are reviewing are people not involved in the initial drafting, right? Because you need that space to really make sure it's coming through. Make sure you're reviewing against the evaluation criteria for your specific grant. And then consider having multiple people review with different kinds of expertise. So expertise on your community, expertise on the approach you're taking, expertise on grants, people who have expertise on language, proofreaders. Really try and make sure you're having all those reviewers and build in that time. Some resources we have, some links here for data sources, and they're all really different. I encourage you to explore data sources and thinking about where you get data for your grants. There's also proposal support, and Emily can talk a little bit about the JTF's opportunities for support.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, so I think Antonia may have dropped this in the chat a few minutes back. Antonia, maybe you can put the form in one more time, but we do have some limited capacity support to provide one-on-one consultation and crafting your proposal and then conducting one of those proposal reviews that Rebecca was just mentioning. So we have a form. I know a couple people filled it out right before the webinar today, so that's great. But we'll be taking a look at those and be reaching out to folks that we are able to support through that. And then I also just want to let the group on the webinar know that, as I mentioned earlier, JTF also has our grant making side, and we anticipate releasing an RFP to help support the development of federal applications. So this will be released soon, and we'll make sure that if you registered for this webinar, for the folks on the list, that you'll be able to see that RFP as well as an opportunity.
Great. So with that, let's go to the questions. I can look at this first question here. This is Pamela Eaton. This is a really great question, and I'm just going to read it so folks can have a sense. It says, it seems like there's a tension for communities that are trying to transition their economies between building on existing economic strengths and building up new sectors of the economy. How will EDA evaluate the transition aspects of these proposals? And that's a really good question. And I don't think I can say exactly, not being EDA myself, how they will evaluate that. But I think this is something that they are really thinking about right now. It has been true in the past that EDA has been more focused on building on existing sectors rather than developing new ones. There have been some programs that are more oriented in that direction. But I think with this funding, they are really thinking about that. And they are really thinking about economic transition and what that means. I think the thing that you need to do if you're really trying to develop something new in your economy that hasn't been there before is to make a really strong case for why you have what it takes to build that, right? What are the assets that your community has that are going to allow you to build up that new sector? And there are, depending on what that is, there are resources out there that can help you think about that and provide evidence for it, right? So for instance, if you're looking at trying to build a tech economy in rural, the Center on Rural Innovation has lots of resources on that kind of approach and, how you can approach it, what you can look at as assets for that, things like that. So, but that's not the only one. There are lots of resources out there for that. But you just have to really make the case that you do have, even though you don't have that sector active now, that you do have what it takes to build it. And this is why it's important. This is why it's the right approach for your community. Let's see here. We have some more questions. Let's see, how to differentiate persuasive versus promotional in the language. That is a very good question. So I think that for EDA, language is persuasive when it really describes an exciting project, right? And if there has to be the backup there, right? For EDA, it's persuasive when the evidence is there and when the content is there. Promotional, I've seen a lot of drafts of EDA grants that I would call promotional. And the thing that they have in common is that there's not a lot of there, right? There's a lot of excitement and enthusiasm, and we're going to do great things. But the detail on the things and how they're going to lead to the outcomes is just not there. So I think that for EDA, detail is really persuasive. Let me look in here. Including attachments for ED 900 responses instead of answering in the form. That is not usually done. If for some reason you feel like you need to do that, ask your EDR before you do something like that. It's usually done in the form. And I'm not sure, I don't know if Richard Marsh is able to sort of clarify this question. I'm not sure about the meaning of that question. And I believe there was a hand up. Did we have one earlier, Emily? Or maybe not.
I'm gonna say it's not showing up on my end. I do just want to flag, we had one question in the chat just about the timing for JTF's RFP. And those will be, that RFP will be released in early October, but the grants for that support will probably not be until end of November, early December timeframe. Thanks for that question, Joey.
Great. And I'm not sure if the question from Richard Marsh is about JTF's funding or EDA's funding. So Richard, you're welcome to clarify. Any other questions? We still do have some more time. I'm happy to chat about other questions if folks have them. We have a raised hand. Emily, are you able to let Crystal talk?
Crystal, if you're able to write your question in the Q&A, I'm getting a notice that due to the version of your Zoom, I'm not able to bring you off mute. So I apologize for that, Crystal, but we'll stay on for a few minutes if you want to type it in the Q&A box.
I've not seen that notification before.
I know, I'm not
the
either.
Version of Zoom. Interesting. How urgent is urgent in terms of priorities? Yeah, so this is a question for your economic development representative, right? So, you know, these projects have to be complete. I believe it's 2027. So there is some time, but they are, you know, like I said earlier, they are really looking for projects that can start quickly. So a project that takes a year and a half to complete is great, it's fine. It just needs to be able to start up quickly, and you need to be able to make a case that that project is going to have impact soon. So interesting. So we have another question here. Are there best practice projects, such as a public school solar development, that can serve as instructive? I don't think there is necessarily a specific kind of project that I can say that, you know, your community should do this project. I think that the thing that you should keep in mind, the Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship, which is EDA's national office that administers the Build to Scale competitions, they have a great sort of tagline that they tend to use, which is place-based, bottom-up, specific to your needs. Right? This is what EDA is looking to fund. Work that's place-based, bottom-up, specific to your needs. So there isn't necessarily one specific kind of project that I could say without knowing your community is the right kind. Let's see. Can EAA fund both programs and construction, or does it need to be one or the other? You mean within one grant? You need to talk to your EDR about it. I think it's easier for them if the grant itself is either program or construction, but there's so much flexibility in the rescue plan funding that I would ask. That's something that you really need to run by them. Okay, so Richard Marsh has typed in again. So there's an opportunity for phase 2 implementation in the Build Back Better Regional Challenge. How about the coal communities applying for EAA funding? So just to sort of compare those two, the EAA funding is more equivalent to the implementation funding in the Build Back Better Regional Challenge, right? So Build Back Better is a 2-phase process. The first is a planning grant, right? And then the second is implementation grants. So EAA grants, you know, they can also, you can request EAA funds for planning, but most of those grants are going to be implementation grants themselves. And if you have an idea for a series, right? If you have an idea for a planning EAA grant that maybe then would lead to implementation, you need to talk to your economic development representative about it, about how that should work. Let's see. Yes, so moving here to, let's see. What if an applicant isn't in an EDA designated EDD region or doesn't have a SEDS? You can talk to them. There can be another, you don't necessarily have to have a SEDS. There can be another designated document that could work, but you have to talk to them about that, what that would be. So we have another question here. Says, kind of off topic of writing a good proposal, but I've heard some rumblings about the potential for EDA to transfer projects between grant programs if there's a better fit. For example, I might submit a travel tourism and outdoor recreation proposal that they decide to run through EAA or something else. Is this true? I haven't heard it from a verified source. Yes, it is true. And if you watch their initial 101 webinar for the rescue plan funding, you'll find an explanation of that. They have they have reserved the right to do that, to be able to transfer between programs. And that doesn't mean that you don't need to talk to them first and ask them which you should be submitting to. What that does is it allows them, as they're triaging, as they're trying to figure out how they can fund these projects, if it turns out they're oversubscribed in one, but have room in another, and there's a project that could fit in either, they can move them around in order to get the money out as quickly as possible. So this is rescue plan funding. They're trying to get it out as soon as they can. And this is just another tool they can use for that.
And Rebecca, we had another question in the chat. So if you have a question, if you could drop it in the Q&A, but in the chat, someone asked if having a current structure, such as the building or remodeling, would be considered as match.
Having it already, there needs to be match that is part of the project itself. So the way match works for EDA is that the whole project is considered, right? So that's 100%, right? 100% is the whole grant project. And the portion of that that's covered by the federal government is the grant rate, and the portion that's covered by the applicant or by other non-federal funds, usually non-federal, is the match. Now, purchasing a building is not usually part of an EDA project, so that's probably not going to be able to count as match. But I'm hesitating here because I don't know the details of the situation, and you need to talk to your economic development representative about it. But the way to think about it is that the whole project is one thing, and then it's divided into pieces, and all of the costs in that project, including the match, have to be allowable costs under the grant program. You can't have match that is not an allowable cost under the program. Now, space can be a matching fund, say if you're renting space or something like that. So I don't have enough detail, is what I'm saying.
So Angeline, for those who asked that question, Antonia did drop in the form again for one-on-one support, where we could dive into that question specifically based on your situation.
Okay, so we have a question here about signing the forms in grants.gov. Do you have to sign them electronically, or can they be signed offline and uploaded? It depends. The whole application has to be submitted electronically through grants.gov and signed electronically. That way the applicant does that. But sometimes there are, say, letters of commitment or partner documents or things like that. Say you have a co-applicant, they can sign their documents offline and you can scan and upload. So it depends, but you do have to electronically sign the submission of the grant. So we have another question here. Does the floor and ceiling refer to the request or total project cost? The request. right? So that the grant, when they're talking about grant amounts, they're talking about the federal portion, if I'm reading the question right. Great. Okay. I'm going to flip over to the chat here to make sure I'm not.
I think I've been monitoring the chat,
Okay.
so I think we are right at 1 Central. So unless if there's any other pressing questions, as we've said multiple times, you can reach out to Rebecca or I. The form for requesting additional assistance has been dropped into the chat a number of times, and you'll be hearing from us with a link to the webinar and a link to the recording of the webinar and the slides in the coming days. So thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you all.